I think it's a good question, Tom. I think for me, there's two ways that I would start with that. So I'd say the more traditional way, where you would sit down and start to interview process owners, IT service owners to understand how their businesses fit together. Now, in some cases, they'll have a level of documentation which you can use as a starting point. In other cases, they won't. But you'll do a level of business analysis to start to understand how their applications are knit together. I think the second way you can do it, and I guess this is something we can do more recently, is there's lots of opportunities now to ingest data that they already have. So they may have it in 5, 6 different systems, but there's the opportunity to pull that together, probably put that through a level of AI in order to correlate that data into one output file. So even if it's legacy, I think you can build up that picture.
It's important to know where you're starting from, right? So take stock of what you've got, have an inventory, but then I would say look at the lifecycle management of those assets, start to understand the life expectancy of the different classifications of assets that you might have. Try to get to a point that you've got abstraction layers, and then you can work with modern open standards instead of proprietary, complex interfaces which pull you back into the legacy world, because as you'd imagine, most of the modern tooling now is geared towards modern technology and open standards, so it doesn't play particularly well if you start going back 10, 20 years in technology terms. So trying to find a way to bridge that technology gap and manage assets at more of an abstract level is a good way to approach the problem.
Tiffany was keen to get to the top 10 systems and really start to add value, but to do that, the team have got to prove their worth, if you like, and they've got to prove their worth on a small scale, which takes time, and the whole thing starts to lose momentum, I think, if that's summed up right.
There is something that has volume that maybe sits outside of your top 10. So good examples like, and I know I used to wonder about sort of shared application permissions or something like an application password reset, something that's unlikely to impact the system itself, but still going to give you a volume play. What you don't want to do is pick a POC on something that's too small, both in terms of volume and criticality, because then you don't hit the business case. Prove your business case or your use case in terms of that dev QA environment, but also then prove that value, because what you're doing is picking something that's still showing it your ability to manage that critical component. So that's the aesthetic transaction model is really, really powerful. And again, that's something that's probably used a lot more in the last 3 or 4 years, because it's become much easier to sort of run that type of transaction now than it ever used to be. And it's a good way of sort of saying, well, okay, we're going to interface with that system to prove the value, but we're not going to touch it, right? We're running something that's not going to cause an issue.
How important is it to understand the hardware and software components of the process in order to be able to take advantage of automation? Is that summed up right yet?
I'd say it's important that somebody understands the business process. It doesn't necessarily have to be at a low level in terms of the hardware and software that might, underpin that process. So Aaron spoke earlier about business analysis. I think if you were to kind of putting process mining aside and automated discovery for a second, somebody ought to be in a position to do the business process mapping and ideally re-engineering, because just simply automating the current process isn't always going to yield the biggest gains, right? I mean, you might get some efficiencies, but you can be hindered just simply because it's not the right process in the first place, or the process hasn't stood the test of time as the organisation has changed.